Hi everyone, welcome to this Q&A with Professor Astrid van Weyenberg. Just a couple of technical things, and is that if you are in the Twitch, remember that you can write your questions there and they will be transferred to the Zoom. You can also join us in the Zoom. Some folks are already here. You're not going to be in camera. We're only going to be spotlighting Astrid and myself, so don't worry about that. I might ask you to ask your question aloud, or I might just read your question, depending on I will just take care of that. It's 2 a.m. for Astrid, which is very generously is staying that late to have this conversation with us. It's really a pleasure to have you with us today. And
Thanks.
so just also like keep that in mind when you're asking those complicated 10 sentence questions, like do your effort to make the question as intelligible as possible. I'm going to start, and then again, just you can already ask the questions in the chat. You can direct those questions to me in the chat in Zoom, or in Twitch. You can just ask the questions and they will be directed to me in the Zoom later on. So you can start posting them right now. I'm going to start with a question on the relationship between mourning and memory, and also the relationship of mourning memory to history, perhaps to counter history, to the extent that you opened your introduction of the film highlighting the fact that it is a painting that is kind of becoming an acting party in this film.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm wondering about how what does that do in rest with the play of Antigone, to the extent that we no longer have an action that is immediately following an event, but we actually have a series of temporal loops, and distances that are actually complicating a history and a counter history and an archive, and the impossibility to reconstruct an archive. So I wonder if you could speak to how do you reflect about this relationship between the act of mourning and then the perhaps the act of counter history writing.
hmm Yeah, thank you for that question, Andres, and thanks very much for having me here. And apologies, should I be yawning in between. Yeah, I think what's really interesting in this documentary is how art is very much becomes a player in facilitating a process of mourning and in facilitating alternative ways of memory making and history making, also in that sense, out of sort of a collective coming together of people gathering around the painting, how the painting facilitates them starting to talk to one another, to enter into a conversation where all these bystanders, the painter also says, right, that he is sort of surprised that so few students nowadays know about that history. And then the painting seems very much about that history in the beginning. But then as the documentary progresses and these students start gathering around the painting and talk together, you see also how it becomes very much to be about their present. So I think it's not only about staging or facilitating some form of public grief, and thereby also let's say filling the gaps in the archive, which the documentary very nicely shows, I think, with this start, right, with the sort of trying to excavate an archive, but it's actually not functioning, and the painting intervenes in that. But it's not just about that past, it's very much about how that past functions in the present, I think, and that actually seems to happen while he paints. And I find that very interesting, how these students start to comment on, hey, this is about our present, this is actually about Kabila, you should mention him, it's not just Mobutu here, and all these comments. I think that's an interesting aspect of this painting, in sort of connecting these different temporalities, or of this documentary, of connecting these different temporalities together, and also in terms of space at at the very same spot where this tragedy happened. I think that's also quite a strong, yeah, it's quite strong to be painting exactly there, right? To put your canvas there. It's almost like excavating this history at the very spot where this happened. But well, we were talking a little bit before as well. This whole emphasis on arts and arts as sort of intervening in that history. I also have the sense that the documentary is quite modest in the claims it makes about what art can do. So it does something, it intervenes in something, it makes something visible, it allows people to talk and, recollect memories and maybe together start some process or of mourning, perhaps. But then there are no grand claims made here, right? It's making something visible, but to say that it's the sort of a revolutionary intervention, I think would be overstating it. And that goes for mourning in general as well, I suppose, right? How mourning is, it's also hard to make grand claims about what mourning does and what public mourning does, I think.
I think this connects nicely with another question that I have about the different modalities on the exercise of political violence, and to the extent that we have, like, one of the things that has been highlighted, for example, about the difference between Anouilh's melodramatic Antigone, and then the classical tragedy of Sophocles, is that when Creon decides not to bury Polynices, Creon actually doesn't know if the body that he's burying is Polynices or is Eteocles, and he seems not to care, not to the extent that there's one body that can be signified as Eteocles and one body that can be signified as Polynices. That's enough for Creon. It is something that is not there in the classical tragedy. But then as we move to the more contemporary, and actually within colonial contexts that are not just internal to Europe, but that have that legacy and that afterlife of colonialism, we actually don't even have the body itself. Now there's an enforced disappearances, the coffin is empty. uh, and I wonder if you see a connection, or what is your reflection in relation to the transformations in the modality of the colonial violence, and then the change also on the aesthetics that are trying to articulate those modalities?
It's a complicated question on this, and I think a very multi-layered one. So maybe you'll help me with this one. But I find the difference is interesting, right? So here in Antigone, or in the original, let's say, the pretext of Sophocles' Antigone, but also in Anouilh's, though with the difference that you mentioned, there is a corpse there of a brother, and it's sort of a material presence that sort of calls on Antigone to act, right? In defiance of the state that leaves the body exposed, it calls on her to act because of that material presence. Whereas in this film, indeed, the coffin that is painted, reflecting also the reality before, it was empty, and it was sort of symbolic of all the bodies that were sort of lost, put in some mass grave, nobody knows where. That's a huge difference, and it asks questions also, about how to even fight for the right to mourn when the bodies that you want to mourn are not even there, right? Are not even present to sort of stand next to and grieve over. And I think the sense that I have is that the painting and the documentary are very important, sort of in the sense that they give some, maybe indirect, but some sort of visual presence to those absent bodies. Maybe materializing the loss in some way, right? Through the painting on that exact spot where the bodies have been murdered, and then drawing the coffin there, and then asking people to sort of come and talk about it. So the sort of political act seems to be more about making something visible in this documentary, I think, through that painting. But what I also started to think about is how, and that's maybe a bit of another discussion, but about how Antigone's mourning over her dead brother, many theorists have sort of asked questions about that also, right? Suggesting that maybe it's not so much to do with her dead brother, who is present next to her in a material presence, but more about her absent father, who is not present, who she could not mourn, whose body is not there to grieve over, which he did on purpose, right? Trying to erase this horrid, incestuous family history. And I think I also referred to that quote by Derrida, where he asks in the introduction, right, where he asks, or he suggests that maybe she's not sort of mourning over her brother, but mourning over the sort of having never been able to mourn her father, basically, and that her tears are primarily about that. Which made her hostage to the past, etc., etc. So in a sense, I think the materializing of her brother's body is also symbolizing something that was absent and that she could not grieve over. So there's sort of a resonance there as well, I think, with the topic in the context of this movie. But I think I'm departing a little bit of what from what your question was, because you were also wondering about what that does to Antigone's, well,
Well,
dissidence.
I was or the aesthetics, like or the ways in which the so tragedy itself is also an art object, like in the sense of the performance, and often taken as uh, as an art object that is precisely trying to convey an act of memory. One thinks about the Hannah Arendt, for example, analysis of tragedy as remembering the act of revolution and like all of that. But there are many different ways of thinking about tragedy as a way of memorializing death, or making an archive for loss, making loss mediatable in some capacity.
Mm-hmm.
And indeed, in this particular case, with regards to the presence of the corpse. But then you have this situation which is, I think, is widespread in colonial engagements with Antigone, like it's not unique to this film, in which enforced disappearances and the way they suspend the status of the one being lost, that is not known if it's actually lost or not, that life and death are suspended and that, rather than resolved in the act of burial. And then the excessive violence continues, with like it doesn't stop at death, but it continues after that. That in this case is actually the irresolution of that, that then you need a different mode of aesthetic engagement, in order to call attention to the excessive violence of even the suspension of that status.
And something that is not ending, right? It perpetuates, whereas
Yeah.
tragedy usually has a sense of closure and sort of catharsis at the end of dealing with the loss in some way. And here there seems to be a sense of repetition and unending. But then I do have the sense that in Sophocles' Antigone, in the trilogy at least, that's already that sort of perpetuation, or having to reenact a loss that was not complete, or a mourning that was not completed or could not be, is also there in some sense thematically, I suppose, right?
Yeah, and in fact, Arendt's actually point of entry for that reflection is Oedipus at Colonus. Is not actually Antigone,
No.
and even more, like it is in the non-specified burial site of Oedipus that that his loss can be weaponized for war. Not that Athens is going to defeat thieves in that unspecified site, which means it also connects to the ongoing violence of the um, instrumental, let's say, to the impossibility of mourning, like to give that continuity to war. Even
Yeah.
if like the Antigone complicates the story of colonial violence a little bit in this case, because it's more of a civil war than it is a colonial war, where in this case we have that element added.
Yes.
um, I don't know if anyone is wanting to ask a question. Those of you who are joining us in the Zoom, I want to give you a chance to meditate on that, or those in the Twitch. Otherwise, I have more questions for Astrid, so I would just continue taking advantage of her generosity of being here with us. Um, I'll give you a minute to think about it.
It's also, everybody has just seen a movie, right? It also takes some time to sort of land after that, I suppose.
You ended while people warm up. You ended your introduction highlighting something that I thought was very important when you're making these distinctions between uh, the Phantoms of Lovanium and, let's say, Tegony or the Island, and is that in this film you see a rather interesting balance between Antigone the activist and Antigone the mourner, that is not just immediately transition into the heroic act of, like, public dissident burial, but is actually more about confronting the severity of an unmediated loss or the impossibility of signifying a loss because of the afterlives of colonialism in the dictatorships that take place. And I was wondering if you could maybe expand a little bit about that uniqueness in relation to this documentary. Like if you have something else to share with us about what is unique on
I
that.
have to be a bit careful in the claims I make there because the body of work that I studied was also a selection, obviously, and there's many more Antigone adaptations also in colonial or post-colonial context that I'm not aware of. So I should maybe not be generalizing. But and I also don't know whether people in the audience will be familiar with the two texts that you've just mentioned. Could you tell me that? They won't.
I doubt it. So
I
if
doubt.
you wanna, yeah, I
So
doubt it.
maybe, yeah. So Andres is referring, let me just say that briefly because otherwise what I say won't make any sense. The two texts Andres is referring to, one is by Femi Oshovison, titled Tegoni, an African Antigone, and it's about a Yoruba princess who is sort of posited as a refiguration of Antigone and who challenges colonial rule, but also in a sort of interesting way, post-colonial patriarchy and things like that. So she sort of defies the authorities that limit her. And Antigone is used very much, in terms of sort of a revolutionary heroine there. And the other play that Andres was referencing was The Island by Fugard Kani and Siona, a South African play, which was a protest play during apartheid, about two prisoners on Robben Island. I always forget that because it's a bit different in Dutch. On Robben Island, who during their imprisonment they enact the scene, the trial scene from Antigone, and there too Creon comes to stand for apartheid ideology and authority, and Antigone is the one defying it, which then was a very familiar story to those who suffered under apartheid and were arrested because of, for example, burning a passport in the case of this play. So in both these refigurations or adaptations, I studied them as adaptations, Antigone is very much this revolutionary heroine who is sort of activist, who defies authority, who tries to act according to her beliefs, etc. And it seems to be that this, in the sort of reception history of Antigone in an African context, this is quite a dominant trend to highlight that. And I have felt when I wrote about that, I was always a bit astonished how, especially also in the South African context, but also in the Nigerian context, how this sort of other importance of Antigone as this embodiment of or symbol for mourning, or the difficulty to mourn, or the inability to mourn properly, embodying loss and grief and things like that, which were so relevant to these specific contexts of apartheid, South Africa, of colonial Nigeria, were so, well, they were slightly present in those plays, but very much not highlighted. And the emphasis was very much on his activism. And I felt, and that's what I wrote about in my book, as sort of in a sense, these other roles of Antigone are actually so relevant to the contexts that they that they figure her in, right? And I felt that this documentary very nicely strikes the balance between an emphasis on both. And maybe that goes back to what I said earlier about how I don't see this as a documentary that sort of exclaims, how art can be revolutionary, or it is much more modest, I think. So there's this sort of promise of Antigone's sort of activist potential in the performance that's referenced, and in the other sort of more subtle indirect references. But there's also very much an emphasis on the losses and the grief, and also the ongoing losses and grief, especially with this, that really struck me at the end, actually, these young students talking about their contemporary reality, which seems not to have changed so much from 69. So there's a balance there. I feel that maybe some of those other plays or refigurations do not. But then again, I'm also a bit hesitant to say that, because you very quickly fall into this trap of what does Thomas Leach call that when he talks about adaptation, this sort of trap of the fallacy of fidelity, right? Like there has to be some sort of truthness to the duality of Antigone in these refigurations. While these playwrights, they very much interpret her as an activist figure because that's what their context sort of asked for at that moment, right? And I think that's is also why in that reception history, especially in an African context, this activist potential takes sort of center stage. So it's not, I'm not saying they're not doing justice to the original Antigone, but I think we could sort of, this sort of voice, this sort of emphasis on activism does entail the danger of drowning out some of these other voices that Antigone also speaks to. That's a sense I have, at least. But maybe this doesn't make much sense if you don't know the other plays. But yeah, and I find this a very strong documentary in that sense because of that ending and that emphasis on this position of students, on the sort of precarity that is perpetuating there. It's no grand claim in this documentary, and that makes it stronger for me.
Ranji, would you like to ask your question live?
Hi. Hi again, Astrid. I'm interested, I'd love to hear you say more about the painting, because it seems as if you know, you described it, I think, as sort of becoming a character in the play, and yet it's very much it almost seems like a witness that is that is not exactly a character, but is in a sense the unconscious of character, or something like that, or the unconscious of the play, perhaps. I'm just interested in the way in which sort of the phantoms that emerge in the art object, in a sort of figurative way, but also as somewhat non-human, whether there's a way of thinking about them in relation to the unconscious in Antigone as well. I mean, you know, when you were talking before, and I like this interpretation very much of in a sense, Polynices being in a sense a substitute, or at least an instantiation of the loss that could never be mourned in the presence of the actual father. There's a lot going on there around presence and absence, obviously. And so I'm just interested in the way in which the idea of the non-human or the painting as witness might map onto that. Thanks.
And the non-human, you mean what exactly with that? With reference to the
yes, to some extent, the idea of the phantom, and you know, which, you know, I mean, one could think about this as sort of the visor effect or something. You know, there's both the phantom that has some kind of figurative resemblance, and yet it's also always drawing attention to the fact that it is an art object, right?
Yeah, which this painting very clearly does, right?
Right.
With several, I'm also no art expert, but like I have it on my phone, which is why I'm looking down. But it does very much highlight that, right? Like this is a representation in a specific way, through the hand that comes in with the painting, which makes it very sort of self-reflexive. I'm painting this as we speak, so I'm in the process of bearing witness, maybe, as you say. I think you're right, it's more a witness than a character. I think that's nicely said. But also I think in the, you know, part of it is black and white, other parts are colored, are made more explicit. There are historical figures in this, so there's specific student leaders bearing the coffin who people could recognize also. But there's also more, there's also people there who you would not all recognize, but most of them he gets from photographs, right? He's painting after photographs. And so he has this number of photographs with people there who were murdered, and he tries to sort of bring them to life, but not quite in this painting. And I think the fact that he's sort of using photographs is also quite important, right? In the sense of he's really using an archive to make this painting, but then he's also very much drawing attention to the fact that this is an artistic intervention, and perhaps also thereby highlighting that these people are no longer there, right? All I can do is draw them, and try and represent something of that history and make a sort of collage of that. Um, yeah,
And
I would have to think a
I
bit
was
more
also
about that.
I was also thinking about that is also the name of the band, no? The
Yes,
Phantoms
it's
of
also the name of the
Lovanium
band.
is also
Yes.
the name of the band, which of course is sung with regards to the question that Ranji was posing vis-a-vis the unconscious, where you have this sort of non-logos or like anti-logos sort of articulation of sound that is often associated with the cry of mourning that is not like already translated into like a clear demand that can have like a rational deliberation or mediation. So there's also a little bit of that with regards to the unconscious and perhaps the polysemantic aspect of the phantom here that has multiple reference. um,
Yeah, and I think also the whole what we were talking about earlier, that it's not just refigurations of the past here, but there's very much about the resonances in the present of these students standing there. So, and that's the thing with the phantom as well, right? That it has a manifestation in the here and now. It's never past or beyond or gone or yeah.
and I think your reference to Derrida is quite useful to the extent that the Derrida's approach to the specter is that the specter comes as much from the past as it comes from the future. No? That is both l'avenir and arrivant as well. I think the connection that you're making to the students is a good transition towards a question that Emma Kupit, if I'm pronouncing your last name correctly, is asking in the chat. So I'm going to read part of it, and it's asking, what do you think is the role that truth-telling and testimony is playing in this film? Because in some ways, the film is based on talks from the students as a group, but it actually doesn't speak about their individual stories. No, it's about sort of the collective. And so, what do you think is the role of testimony, truth-telling in relation to this film?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, that's interesting. That sort of tension, maybe a little bit between sort of the individual stories of loss and a sort of collective act here of trying to commemorate collectively. I'm not entirely sure whether I would say that there are no individual stories in the documentary. At least I felt that, with these memories of different people being interviewed, and also with the people standing by the painting, who then somebody remembers something that his father once told him about and I do think it becomes sort of a collection of these stories that together seems to make some sort of collective memory, or sort of to write history collectively in some way. Um, and in that sense, it becomes a testimony about what happened in the past, a testimony about something that is not spoken about anymore, that most people don't even know about anymore. But I'm wondering about the truth telling, what the person asking the question would refer to, or would imply with the truth telling, maybe in the sense that this is sort of oral history, trying to sort of testify to what actually did happen, and what was not conveyed in the archive, and what was lost, and what was not becoming part of this, our sort of national history, because it's not openly talked about. Maybe in that sense, that it tries to sort of intervene in what is actually the narrative of our country here, post-independence, but also with the sort of specter of colonialism, I think, in that. but then truth is always a bit of a difficult notion, right? To talk about.
I think I like something that you're saying there on with regards to the perhaps contrast between the impossibility to reconstruct the event through its technological archive, like the fact that the films and the radio and like it's rusted and you cannot do it through that way. But then the oral history seems to be the place where in a sense where it survives, and it survives also in unclear ways, no, that the painter knows about this story in which his own dad participated, not from his dad but actually when he
From
travels to
Europe.
Europe and here is there and then can't reconstruct it. So it's not a linear, like the oral history also happens in these different ways of dislocating
Exactly.
geographies.
And what's also really nice, I think, is that the audience that gathers around this painting is not just the students, right? There's like other people on campus, but there's also a lot of kids. So there's also this sort of intergenerational memory um, theme, you could say, in there's kids listening there to what is being told, just as the people telling are conveying stories of their father. So it's very much about how to convey his or how to transmit history to a next generation if the sort of official archive is lacking, and then with an emphasis on oral history. I also think there's something ritualistic about how this happens here with this, how it's through this painting that this starts to happen in this exact spot, in this exact time, to this exact act. That's how it's sort of, that's what sparks it. And it reminded me a little bit of how ritual is theorized as well as this sort of one instance, which involves the collective slowly, and but then maybe not as transformative. I'm not entirely sure whether that connection is very useful, but yeah, I find this sort of this emphasis on this is telling a story what the, as you say, what the official records cannot tell us is quite strong here. And this sort of start of the to start the documentary with that, with people trying to salvage these tapes. And we also don't quite learn how were they damaged. Was it, you know, because Congo has known a lot of war? Was it because of war and conflict, or were there other reasons? Was it just not managed because nobody cared? Or yeah, that remains a bit unclear here.
I'm gonna end with one last question. I mean, if anyone has like something urgent in the Twitch or on the chat, feel free to like write it down, and we'll see if there's time. But Astrid has already been quite generous staying with us. So I'm gonna
really awake. Don't worry.
I'm gonna ask a question about the multiplicity of Antigones that are collected in this movie, not to the extent that we have on the one hand the play itself, not Anouilh's version that is read the day before the riots in 1969. But then we have the very clear resonance of the event 2 years later, in which you have the two burials, not the burial of Mobutu's mom, and then the denial of the request of the students to do the commemoration of the students. And then you also have the painting itself, no, that is in a sense a kind of Antigonian gesture. And then you also have the repetition of the reading that kind of makes a full circle of the Anouilh that ends in a kind of comedic release also that we see this. So I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on this pluralizing of Antigones that I think is also a feature, like, you know, Antigone does the same, like eventually Antigone comes back and you have always not just one Antigone, but you actually have a plurality of Antigones taking the stage in order to make connections. You have any thoughts, anything that you want to share about that?
Thinking also in terms of how Antigone is so is open to so many interpretations with different emphasis, right? In terms of emphasizing more the activist potential, emphasizing more her role as somebody trying to mourn and grieve. And I think that these different refigurations or multiplications, you use that word, right? Which is a good word here, yeah. That they also sort of highlight these different interpretations or different readings of Antigone that sort of collectively make it a very rich interpretative history also that lies behind it. With Antigone, the what happens is slightly different because there Antigone is sort of doubles, right? So we have an African Antigone, Tagony, and then next to her comes Antigone on stage, and they become sort of acting twin sisters. And I think something specific happens there also in the sense of, let's say, responding to a dominant canon and canonical text. I don't see that as much. I don't see the relevance of that gesture as much here in this movie. But this sort of, yeah, different layers with different emphasis. Um, that's quite interesting. Also, indeed, the repetition at the end, right? Which also brings it to the present of these students talking about Kabila at that moment. And then us viewing this documentary in the here and now when we have another president who again turns out to be not so much of a, a better, not able to improve the situation of the Congolese as people had hoped he would. And I was also thinking of, there was this activist, youth activist who wrote somewhere, Kabila, we first had Kabila's father, then we had Kabila the son, and now we have Kabila the ghost, which I think is also interesting in this respect. So this idea that this something seems to be haunting here also in terms of that sort of dictatorial presence that doesn't seem to sort of go away despite the repetition of these Antigone-like acts that we intervene with. Or
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm actually curious to hear you on that also for a sec.
Well, one of the things that, or one of the thoughts that I had with that multiplication is an overcoming of the isolation of Antigone in that gesture. No, that in a sense
Ah,
the act of mourning where she's requesting the help of his many, and in that sense engaging potentially in collective action, and then gets like potentially broken depending on what interpretation you take. Like there are some interpretations that, like in the case of Bonnie Honig, that claim that there is indeed a sororal action being staged in order precisely to move away from the isolated either civil disobedience iconic figure or like objection conscious objection kind of figure into a more like collective voice. And I
collective.
wonder if part of the multiplication is to call attention to that gesture of a mourning that is no longer that is public, but is no longer just oikos or just exclusively like a family drama, but it's actually more of a national um, event.
That's a nice interpretation, and that would sort of salvage Antigone from the critique that a lot of people or critique the specific interpretation where she is thought to just act on her own, just act out of a family history of not having been able to mourn her father. Her act is not at all political, perhaps because of her private individual motivations. She claims to act on behalf of a collective, but is she really, etc.? That's quite a strong debate, right, in the reception of Antigone. And then this could sort of be seen to intervene in that, like she's sort of made part of a larger collective, which then also makes the act more political in that sense, more political resonance, maybe. I like that.
Astrid, thanks a lot for staying with us for this
Thank you.
conversation. Thanks to all of you who watch all of these 4 films with us. We're coming to the end of our Antigone film series, but the Antigone reading group continues. So next year, we're going to have the International Colloquium in the fall, hopefully in person at Duke University. So send us emails, keep in touch. We will be sending you information. Thanks a lot to Screen Society, to the John Hope Franklin Humanities Institute, and all the programs that co-sponsor this event, the Endowment Fund that also help us to bring these films. And thank you all and have a very good night. Thanks, Astrid, again.
Thanks
Thank you.
very much, Andres.